Songs that I wrote when I was with women were really about women, and the songs that I've written since have been fairly obviously about men.
A different corner and we never would have met.
George Michael once admitted something that still shocks fans today. He said that if there was one song where you could hear his heart speaking directly, no barriers, no disguises, it was A Different Corner.
But to lose you would cut like a knife, so I...
Think about that. Out of all the anthems, out of all the pop hits that filled stadiums and dominated radio, it wasn't the flashy numbers that carried his truth. It was a quiet, haunting ballad that he wrote completely alone, sitting in silence with nothing but his pain. The song sounds fragile, just his voice, tender and uncertain, carried by a melody so bare it feels like it could break at any second. But inside those words lived something George had carried in secret, something that weighed on him so heavily that years later he admitted he could no longer hide it. The superstar image, the confident smile, the polished performances made him look untouchable, but A Different Corner cracked that image wide open. It was not the voice of a man in control. It was the voice of someone who had lost something he couldn't get back. And here's the mystery. What was the secret? Was it simply about heartbreak, about love slipping through his hands? Or was it a deeper confession, tied to the parts of his life the world wouldn't discover until much later? Stay with me, because this isn't just the story of a song. It's the story of how one young man at the height of fame poured a hidden truth into music, and how that truth changed the course of his life forever. You're watching Retro Waves, the channel that takes you behind the songs into the places where fame and pain collide. Here we don't just celebrate the hits, we uncover the hidden stories, the secrets and the confessions that made those hits possible. If you're new here, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories that peel back the curtain on music's greatest legends. And George Michael's story, this one might be the most vulnerable confession he ever left behind. To understand A Different Corner, you first have to picture the world George Michael was living in during 1985. He was only in his early 20s, but his face was everywhere. Wham! Had become one of the biggest pop acts on the planet almost overnight. Their songs were bright, colorful, and full of energy. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go wasn't just a hit, it was a global phenomenon.
Wake me up before you go, go. Don't leave me hanging on like a yo-yo.
Last Christmas had already cemented itself as a classic.
Please, to save me from tears, I'll give it to some.
On stage, George danced in neon shorts and smiled for cameras, selling an image of youth, freedom, and fun. From the outside, it looked like a dream. Millions of fans, fame beyond imagination, and endless opportunities ahead. But inside, George was unraveling. Fame didn't feel like freedom, it felt like a trap. Every step he took was watched. Every song he released was measured against the last. He was expected to stay cheerful, keep churning out upbeat tracks, and never let the world see anything less than perfection. On top of that, George was carrying something even heavier. He was not publicly open about his sexuality, and in the mid-1980s, being gay in the pop spotlight was almost unthinkable. He later admitted that hiding this truth from the public and even from parts of his private circle caused him immense loneliness, and then came heartbreak. George rarely revealed details, but he confessed years later that A Different Corner was born from a moment of devastating loss. A love, private and deeply personal, had left him. He said it was the only song he ever wrote and recorded completely on his own, in just a matter of hours, because he had no one else to turn to. Imagine that. A young man adored by millions. When the song was released, fans were stunned. This wasn't the George Michael they thought they knew. Gone were the bright colors, the cheeky smiles, the playful hooks. Instead, here was a fragile ballad that sounded like a diary entry whispered into a microphone, and it begged a question. What exactly had broken him so deeply? Was it just a fleeting romance gone wrong, or something tied to the parts of himself he was still forced to hide from the world? That question would haunt George for years, and it's where our journey begins, because A Different Corner wasn't just a hit single. It was the first time George Michael admitted through song that he couldn't keep his secret hidden forever. Most hit songs in the 1980s were built inside buzzing studios, teams of producers, engineers and writers, layering tracks, perfecting every beat. But A Different Corner was nothing like that. George Michael recorded the entire thing by himself. No bandmates, no co-writers, no producers breathing down his neck. Just George, sitting with a keyboard and tape recorder, building something so personal that he didn't trust anyone else to be part of it. Later, he admitted this was the only time in his career he worked this way, and that alone tells you how unusual the moment was. George wasn't just experimenting, he was desperate. Fans didn't know it at the time, but George was at a crossroads. Wham! Was still officially together, but cracks were forming. His partnership with Andrew Ridgeley had given him fame, but it was no longer enough. George wanted to write music that reflected who he really was, not just playful pop designed for teen magazines. So when heartbreak struck, he did what artists often do. He went into hiding, sat with the pain, and turned it into art. The words came quickly, the melody followed. George once said it was like the song wrote itself, an unfiltered rush of emotion that poured out of him. But here's the remarkable thing. The final recording you hear on A Different Corner is George layering everything himself. Every vocal harmony, him. Every keyboard note, him. Every sound on that record was George alone, late at night, pulling truth out of silence. When you listen to it now, you can feel that isolation, the pauses, the empty spaces between chords. They weren't mistakes. They were reflections of the room he was sitting in. Quiet, hollow, heavy. And it leaves us asking, who exactly was George writing to? He never named the person. Some believe it was a brief romance. Others claim it was tied to a secret love he couldn't acknowledge publicly at the time. That part remains uncertain. What is certain, though, is this. George had never sounded so vulnerable, and soon the world would hear it. When A Different Corner was released in March 1986, it didn't sound like anything else on the radio.
In all of these years, you are the only one to stop my...
Pop was dominated by synth-driven anthems, dance beats, and flashy hooks. But here was George Michael, barely 23 years old, whispering about heartbreak with nothing but a fragile melody. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some praised the bravery. Others wondered if fans would abandon him for being too soft, too serious, or even too broken. But then something happened that no one predicted. The song climbed straight to #1 in the UK. Overnight, it proved that listeners weren't just chasing happy pop tunes. They were connecting to George's honesty, the vulnerability, the cracks in his voice. People didn't just hear the song, they felt it, and that was rare. Most pop stars at the time were about image, not confession. But George had done something different. He'd let the mask slip. In interviews later, George admitted that A Different Corner wasn't just another single, it was his first true solo statement. Though still technically part of Wham, this was the moment he broke away creatively. He was no longer just the poster boy of a pop duo, he was an artist in his own right, capable of writing something that sounded like a diary entry. But the public reaction also raised questions. Fans began to wonder, what was really behind those lyrics? What love had he lost? Why did he sound so devastated when in photos he was still smiling, still posing, still selling the dream of fame? And that contradiction fueled the song's mystery. People could feel George was hiding something, but they didn't yet know what. The single's success shocked the industry too. Executives realized George wasn't just a teen idol, he was a songwriter with depth, capable of pulling millions of people into a quiet ballad about heartbreak. And yet for George, the success was bittersweet, because even though the world was celebrating the song, no one knew the weight it carried for him. No one knew the loneliness behind those notes, and no one knew the secret he still couldn't bring himself to say out loud. That secret would follow him for years, and eventually it would break open in ways he couldn't control. When A Different Corner soared to #1, the celebration wasn't just for George Michael. On paper, Wham was still together, but behind the scenes, the writing was on the wall. Andrew Ridgeley, George's partner and longtime friend, had always supported George's growing ambition. But even Andrew knew this song wasn't Wham material. It wasn't playful, it wasn't colorful, and it certainly wasn't the kind of track you'd expect to hear on a stadium tour filled with neon shorts and choreographed dance moves. This was George, stepping into his own, because once the world heard George's voice stripped bare, once they heard his personal confession in song, there was no going back to bubblegum pop. George Michael was already moving towards something bigger, more serious, and more honest. But honesty wasn't easy, because even as he was breaking free musically, he was still trapped personally, hiding a secret that made every love song he wrote feel like both a confession and a cover-up. Years later, George Michael admitted that A Different Corner was the most honest thing he had ever recorded, but at the time of its release, few understood just how honest it really was. The lyrics themselves feel simple, lines about love slipping away, about a fragile connection suddenly gone, but listen closer, and you hear more than just heartbreak. You hear fear, you hear isolation, you hear a young man desperate to tell the truth, but terrified of what that truth might cost him. George never publicly named who inspired the song. That mystery has kept fans speculating for decades. Some claimed it was about a short-lived relationship with a woman in his circle at the time. Others whispered without proof that it might have been tied to a man George loved but couldn't acknowledge publicly. Important note, these theories remain rumors. George himself never confirmed them. What he did confirm is that the song came from an intensely private heartbreak that left him feeling like he had no one else to turn to. And when you place that in the context of 1985, it becomes clearer. George was not yet publicly open about his sexuality. The fear of exposure, of losing everything, loomed over him constantly. To write openly about a hidden love, especially if it was a same-sex relationship, could have ended his career before it began. So instead, he disguised it. He poured his feelings into a song vague enough to hide the details, but raw enough that listeners felt the truth. And that's why A Different Corner hit so hard. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was heartbreak amplified by secrecy, silence, and fear. The success of A Different Corner proved that George Michael could stand on his own.
I don't understand it. For you, it's a breeze.
But success didn't erase the pain behind it. As his fame grew, so did the pressure to keep parts of himself hidden. He later confessed that in those years, he often felt like two people, the public star who smiled for cameras and the private man who carried secrets in silence. Friends said George was kind, generous, and deeply loyal, but he was also guarded. He rarely let anyone close enough to see the depth of his loneliness, and when he did, it often ended in heartbreak. That's what made A Different Corner so powerful. For 3 minutes and 37 seconds, George dropped the mask. He didn't smile, he didn't dance, he didn't pretend. He just told the truth, in the only way he felt safe to do it, through music. For fans, it was a revelation. Here was a superstar who sounded human, fragile, and broken. But for George, it was a reminder of what he still couldn't say out loud. The irony was cruel. The song that gave him freedom musically also reminded him of his cage personally, and in the years to come, that cage would grow tighter, until eventually it broke wide open. Years after the release of A Different Corner, George Michael finally admitted what many fans had long suspected, that the song wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about loneliness, about silence, about carrying a secret he couldn't share with the world. In interviews, George said the track was the only one he had ever written and recorded entirely alone. That detail wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. He was literally alone in that moment, emotionally and physically, and he admitted that the sadness behind the song came from a love that had left him devastated. Though he never revealed the full identity of the person, George acknowledged that A Different Corner carried the weight of a hidden relationship. To protect himself, he kept the lyrics vague, but for those who listened closely, the emotion was undeniable. And when George later came out publicly in the late 1990s, the song took on an even deeper meaning. This wasn't just a young man's breakup song, it was the sound of someone wrestling with love in the shadows, afraid of losing everything if the truth slipped out. That's why A Different Corner remains so haunting.
Take me back in time, maybe I can forget.
It wasn't just George's confession in 1986, it was a preview of the battles he would face for the rest of his life, the fight between the man the world saw and the man he really was. And the world could feel it, even if they didn't yet know the full story. Looking back, A Different Corner became more than just a ballad, it was a turning point. The moment George Michael stopped being just a pop star and started being an artist. It also became a symbol of honesty, even if that honesty was only partial at the time. The song revealed George's vulnerability without exposing all the details. He gave the world a piece of his truth, wrapped in melody, at a time when he couldn't risk giving them the whole thing. Today, fans and critics see it as a brave moment, not because George was loud about his struggles, but because he dared to whisper them when whispering was all he could do, and that's why the song still resonates. Because we all know what it's like to hold something inside, to carry a secret, or to love someone we can't hold on to. George Michael put that feeling into words and melody in a way few artists ever have. It's important to note that while many rumors have circulated about who inspired the song, the only confirmed truth is that it came from George's personal heartbreak and solitude. Anything beyond that is speculation, never directly confirmed by him. For George, A Different Corner was a diary entry the whole world could read, but only he knew the full story. And that's why, decades later, it still makes listeners stop, listen, and feel the weight of a secret that was too heavy to hide. So now the question is yours. When you hear George Michael whisper through A Different Corner, what do you hear? Do you hear a simple ballad about heartbreak, or do you hear the hidden cry of a man who couldn't yet tell the world who he really was? Either way, one thing is certain. George Michael left behind one of the most personal confessions ever written in pop music. A song born from solitude, shaped by heartbreak, and forever tied to the secret he admitted he could never hide. And that's why we tell these stories here on Retro Waves. Because behind every song you know, there's a story you don't. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and join us here every week as we dive into the songs that shaped our lives and the secrets that shaped the artists. And tell me in the comments, what do you think George was really confessing in A Different Corner? Because sometimes the truth lives between the lines.